Paul checked his bank account. Something felt different. Not the number exactly, just how it felt to see the number. For the first time in years, Paul didn't immediately close the app. Didn't feel that familiar stomach drop. Didn't start calculating whether coffee was affordable this week. He just looked and breathed. $20,000. It took Paul 3 years to get here. 3 years of saying no, of skipping things, of watching everyone else spend while he saved. 3 years that felt long until they didn't, because something changed when Paul crossed $20,000. Not gradually, suddenly. Like a switch flipped in his brain. The same job felt different. The same budget felt different. The same life felt different. Paul wasn't richer in the way people think of rich. He just stopped being poor in the way that matters most. He stopped operating from fear. Before $20,000, Paul lived differently. Every decision was filtered through scarcity. Take the job or risk having nothing. Stay in the situation or risk the unknown. Say yes even when you want to say no. Because no cost money Paul didn't have. This isn't dramatic poverty. It's just constant, low-grade financial fear. The kind that doesn't make headlines, just makes everything harder. Paul's car made a noise. A new noise. Probably nothing. Maybe something expensive. Paul didn't take it to a mechanic, because what if it was $800? What if Paul didn't have $800? Then what? So Paul ignored it, hoped it would go away, turned the radio up. This is what $0 in savings does to your brain. It makes you avoid problems instead of solving them, because solving costs money, and money is the thing you don't have. Paul's boss was unreasonable. Often asked Paul to work weekends, without extra pay, without warning, without consideration. Paul said yes, every time. Not because Paul wanted to, because Paul needed the job more than the job needed Paul, and everyone knew it. That's the position you negotiate from when you have nothing saved. Weakness, desperation, no leverage, no options, just compliance. Paul hated it, but hating something doesn't change it. Money changes it. Paul went to a wedding, out of state, flight, hotel, gift, $1,200 total. Paul put it on a credit card, not because Paul was reckless, because saying no felt worse than debt. The debt would hurt later, missing the wedding would hurt now, and now always feels more urgent than later. So Paul charged it and added another monthly payment to the pile. Another decision made from scarcity instead of strategy. This is survival mode, where every choice is between bad options, where you're not building toward anything, just trying not to fall further behind. Paul wasn't failing. Paul was surviving, and survival is exhausting. Paul started with $0. Well, negative, $3,200 in credit card debt. That had to go first. Took Paul 8 months. 8 months of every extra dollar going to the balance. No dinners out, no new clothes, no breathing room, just debt payoff until it was zero. Then Paul started saving. $500 a month. Sometimes $600 if Paul picked up extra hours. Sometimes $400 if something broke. But consistently forward, month after month, for 3 years. The first $1,000 took forever. 2 months of discipline. For a number that didn't feel significant. $1,000 wouldn't change Paul's life. It wouldn't solve any real problems. It was just proof that Paul could do this, that saving was possible. The first $5,000 felt better. That was 10 months, almost a year. $5,000 could cover most emergencies. Could buy Paul time if something went wrong. Could be the difference between panic and plan. But it still didn't feel like wealth. It felt like a buffer, important, but not transformative. Paul kept going. $10,000 took 20 months total, a year and 8 months of saving. This felt significant. $10,000 was real money, money that mattered, money that could do something. But Paul didn't touch it, didn't celebrate, didn't reward himself, just kept saving, because $10,000 wasn't the goal. $20,000 was. Paul didn't know why $20,000 felt important. Just that it did, like crossing some invisible threshold. From striving to stable, from surviving to building, from fragile to secure. The last $10,000 took 16 months, faster than the first. Not because Paul saved more, because the money started helping. The $10,000 earned interest. Not much, maybe $400 over the year. But that was $400 Paul didn't have to save. $400, the money saved itself. The math was starting to work, slowly, quietly, but noticeably. Paul hit $20,000 on a Tuesday. Nothing special about the day, just another deposit, another month of discipline. But when Paul saw the balance, something shifted. $20,347. Paul stared at it, not with pride exactly, just with relief, like he'd been holding his breath for 3 years, and finally exhaled. The next day, Paul's car made that noise again, the one he'd been ignoring. Paul took it to a mechanic, without anxiety, without mental gymnastics about whether he could afford the answer. The repair was $680. Paul paid it, in cash, from checking, not from savings. The $20,000 stayed untouched. But knowing it was there changed everything. Paul wasn't spending the money. He was spending the feeling of having the money, the confidence, the options, the ability to solve problems instead of avoiding them. 2 weeks later, Paul's boss asked him to work Saturday. Again, no extra pay. Paul said no, calmly, without explanation, without apology. Just no. The boss seemed surprised. Paul had never said no before, but Paul wasn't the same person anymore. Paul had walking away money, not enough to quit tomorrow, but enough to survive if things went wrong. And that changed the negotiation entirely. Paul didn't need the specific job. Paul needed a job, any job, and $20,000 gave Paul time to find a better one if necessary. The boss didn't fire Paul, just nodded and asked someone else. Paul went home and felt something unfamiliar, control, not over everything, but over enough. Paul's brain worked differently now, not consciously, just automatically. Before $20,000, Paul's thoughts were reactive. How do I afford this? What if something goes wrong? Can I survive until Friday? Constant low-level threat assessment. After $20,000, Paul's thoughts shifted. How do I grow this? What opportunities make sense? Where should this money go next? Same brain, different questions, because the brain can't think about growth when it's focused on survival. Can't plan the future when the present feels unstable. Can't see opportunity when everything looks like threat. $20,000 bought Paul mental space, the ability to think past next week, to make decisions based on strategy instead of fear, to choose instead of react. This is what most people don't understand about savings. It's not about the number, it's about the psychology the number creates. Paul stopped checking prices at the grocery store, not because Paul was rich, because Paul's financial life didn't hinge on whether bananas cost 50 cents or 70 cents a pound. That difference wouldn't change anything. Paul's housing cost mattered. His car payment mattered. His savings rate mattered. The small stuff just didn't. And not sweating small stuff freed up enormous mental energy. Energy Paul could spend on actual wealth building, on career moves, on learning, on opportunities, instead of agonizing over coffee. Paul also stopped taking every opportunity that paid. Before $20,000, Paul would pick up any side work, deliver food, freelance gigs, whatever paid. Not because Paul needed the specific dollars, because Paul couldn't afford to say no to money. After $20,000, Paul got selective. Some gigs paid well, but took too much time. Not worth it. Some opportunities paid okay, but built skills. Worth it. Paul could afford to think long-term, to invest time in things that might not pay immediately, but would pay more later. This is what wealth does. It buys options, and options buy better outcomes. Paul kept saving, same $500 a month, same discipline, same routine. But something was different. The money grew faster, not because Paul saved more, because the first $20,000 was working, earning returns, compounding, helping. Paul's investment account had $20,000 in index funds. At 8% annual return, that's $1,600 a year, $133 a month. Money Paul didn't earn, didn't work for, just received, because the money was working for him. That $133 meant Paul was effectively saving $633 a month, while only contributing $500. The math was accelerating. Getting to the first $20,000 took Paul 36 months, 3 years. Getting to $40,000 took 30 months, 2.5 years, same effort, faster result. This is compound interest, not theoretical, actual, visible, real. By the time Paul hit $60,000, the timeline shrank to 24 months. The money was doing more work than Paul was, contributing more to the total than Paul's paycheck. This is the turning point people talk about, where wealth starts building itself, where you're not pushing the boulder uphill anymore. You're maintaining momentum. Paul didn't feel rich, but Paul felt unstoppable, like the hardest part was over, like everything from here would be easier. And it was. Paul's friend started a business, needed investors, small amounts, $5,000 minimum. Before $20,000, Paul would have said no immediately, not because it was a bad opportunity, because Paul didn't have $5,000 to risk. After $20,000, Paul could consider it, actually think it through, run the numbers, evaluate the risk. Paul didn't invest. The business model didn't make sense. But Paul had the option. That's new. Paul's company offered a professional development program, $2,000 up front, reimbursed after completion. Before $20,000, Paul couldn't do it. $2,000 out of pocket was impossible. After $20,000, Paul enrolled, paid the $2,000, completed the program, got reimbursed, got promoted 6 months later. $8,000 salary increase because Paul could afford to invest in himself. A rental property came on the market, needed work. Price below market because of it. $15,000 down payment required. Before $20,000, Paul would have scrolled past. Nice idea, but not possible. After $20,000, Paul toured it, ran the numbers, decided it wasn't worth the hassle. But again, Paul had the option, could evaluate it, could choose. This is what money buys, not stuff. Options. The ability to say yes when it makes sense, and no when it doesn't, without being forced either way. Paul's coworker also hit $20,000. Around the same time, different outcome. The coworker saw the $20,000 as permission. Permission to upgrade, to spend, to reward himself for the discipline. He bought a new car, $5,000 down payment, $450 monthly payment. The car was nice, nicer than his old one. Felt like success, looked like progress. But the math was brutal. $5,000 down meant his savings dropped to $15,000. $450 a month meant he couldn't save as much going forward. The car depreciated immediately, lost $3,000 in value the moment he drove it off the lot. He traded his financial foundation for a depreciating asset and monthly payments that would last 5 years. Paul watched this happen, didn't say anything. What could he say? But Paul learned something. $20,000 isn't a finish line, it's a starting line. It's not permission to spend, it's the foundation you don't touch, the base everything else builds on. Paul's coworker felt successful for about 3 months. Then the car needed maintenance. $800. He didn't have it. His savings were down to $12,000 and dropping because he couldn't save as much with the car payment. Credit card. The cycle started again. Within a year, he was back where he started, stressed about money, living close to the edge, wondering why he couldn't get ahead. Paul stayed disciplined, kept the old car, kept saving, kept building. The $20,000 became $30,000, then $40,000, then $60,000. While his coworker struggled, same starting point, completely different outcomes. Because Paul understood, $20,000 isn't about what you can buy, it's about what you can become. Getting to $20,000 changed Paul, not just financially, fundamentally. Paul proved something to himself, that he could delay gratification, that he could stick to a plan, that he could control his money instead of letting it control him. This sounds small. It's not. Most people never prove this to themselves. They want to save, intend to save, plan to save, but never actually do it. Not for long enough to matter. Not through the discomfort. Not when everyone else is spending. Paul did. And that made Paul different. Not morally, just practically. Paul became the person who could build wealth, who had the discipline, the patience, the long-term thinking. Everything else was just math. But this, the identity shift, was everything. Because once you become the person who can save $20,000, you become the person who can save $100,000, then $500,000, then more. The skill is transferable. The identity is permanent. Paul looked at money differently now, not as something scarce, as something he could create, could grow, could control. Other people saw money as something that happened to them. Paul saw it as something he directed. That shift made all the difference. $20,000 isn't rich. Paul knows this. It won't retire him, won't buy him a house, won't change his entire life overnight. But it changed enough. Enough to stop living in survival mode. Enough to start thinking strategically. Enough to have options when opportunities appear. Enough to say no when necessary. Enough to weather problems without panic. Enough to feel like progress is possible. That's what $20,000 buys. Not luxury, not freedom, just the foundation, the starting point, the moment when wealth building shifts from impossible to inevitable. Most people never get here. They earn money, they spend money. They live their entire lives in the gap between the two, never building enough buffer to change the game, never crossing the threshold where money starts working for them, never experiencing the psychological shift that makes everything easier. Paul got here, not because Paul was special, not because Paul made a lot of money, not because Paul had help, just because Paul was disciplined for long enough, through enough discomfort, past enough temptation, to prove it was possible, and now everything is different. Paul still has the same job, lives in the same apartment, drives the same car. From the outside, nothing changed, but everything changed. Paul thinks differently, decides differently, lives differently, because Paul crossed the threshold. $20,000, the number that separates surviving from building, reacting from choosing, fragile from stable. Paul won't stop here. This is just the beginning. But it's a beginning that matters, a foundation that holds, a shift that lasts, and that's worth more than the number itself. Thanks for watching. We'll check back in on Paul next time. Another trap, another lesson. This is how money really works.